Hello and welcome. I'm Helen Atkinson, Managing Editor at Supply Chain Brain. I'm excited to be moderating this webinar today, presented by Flex, the title for which is The Shift to Circularity, Closing the Loop. We're going to kick off with a panel session. Then later in the webinar, we're going to open up for a Q&A session with questions from you, the audience. Please submit questions at any time using the tab at the bottom of your screen. We'll not be using people's titles or company names, so please go ahead and ask anything you like. If you don't see your question come up during the webinar, please be assured Flex will reach out to you offline. So what are we talking about today? We're talking about the biggest challenges when dealing with a new circularity landscape. This is about much more than regulations. There's also the pressure for moving towards ESG goals from consumers, clients, and investors. We'll be highlighting the challenges from the point of view of a company in order to understand how best to deal with all this. And we'll be looking at what is a good place for others to start. On top of that, we'll be exploring such issues as how companies deal with the changes involved in achieving circularity, how to foster a culture of circularity, how to invest in sustainable practices, and the sticky challenge of returns, that other half of the circle. Right, without delay, let's meet our presenters. We have Stephen Beard, who is the VP for Business Development at Flex. Stephen leads the team that crafts services solutions for Flex clients around value-added fulfillment and circularity. He's a 30-year-plus veteran of the supply chain industry with experience in consulting, managing operations for brands, and in leadership roles with 3PLs. Paul Slavin has 30 years of industry experience and is the former head of global reverse logistics at Intel Corp, where his duties included the design and delivery of reverse logistics, supply chain, and circular economy solutions that were competitive, cost-effective, and supported Intel's overall supply chain leadership objectives. Tony Shirotta is Executive Director and Publisher of the Reverse Logistics Association, a member-driven global trade association for the returns and reverse industry. Tony has held various industry positions, including 15 years in returns management at Philips. During his Philips years, Tony developed new reverse logistics strategies and implemented many new returns initiatives to advance best practices. And Tony likes to say, you can't be circular without reverse logistics. Welcome, Stephen, Paul, and Tony.
Hello.
Hi. So
Thanks
glad
for
to have
having
you.
us.
So let's get into this panel discussion. Let's dive in. When we did a webinar back in July with Flex, and we discussed the latest regulation updates on circular economy and how these changes are shaping decisions on how brands are trying to achieve their environmental targets. The new regulatory requirements in the market, particularly the EU, are a game changer. Let's start with a quick perspective on how companies are dealing with these changes. Paul, how did Intel shift into a circular model?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. Yeah, I guess maybe I'd start first of all by, at Intel's core manufacturing has had historically a significant focus on ESG programs, whether that's in energy reduction, renewable energy, water usage, et cetera, et cetera. But my specific focus was in reverse logistics, and as you mentioned, some of the changes, particularly from a consumer's perspective, drove a few challenges. Our key focus was really how we tried to engage much tighter to the ESG story and how we would, if you like, address some of those emerging regulatory requirements. We're a little bit insulated because we're an ingredient provider to the broader industry, but we had a lot of focus on return reduction, a lot of focus on keeping product in the marketplace, and we spent a bit of time trying to figure out how could we make better use of the product we were getting back, and how could we drive a balanced approach that met the philosophy of the ESG objectives, was something that actually made business sense. And we had a sort of an epiphany, or maybe I had a sort of an epiphany, which was around the sort of people, planet, profit perspective. In the sense that, a lot of discussion on ESG is it's going to be, or circularity, it's a significant investment. And it's, and the challenge is how do you do that? But our sort of aha was, we were sort of leaving money on the table in being suboptimal of how we manage circularity in our back end. And by being more targeted there and more focused there, we could drive some of that saving back in to support the transformation. So that's really how we started the journey, and that sort of journey continues. And I guess maybe later on we'll get a chance to talk a bit more about that in a bit more detail. But certainly, making that first step, and as I say, getting the epiphany that this is not an evil thing that's coming, or a stick to beat you with. There are opportunities if you can get your head in the right space. There's a win-win here, and really trying to use that approach to drive an agenda that can give you the benefit, as well as address some of the challenges that are clearly going to be in front of you as you go through that roadmap. Yeah.
But I think that's really interesting, Paul, because I think regulation is generally seen as the stick, which is more of the European thing, and in the US we're looking more at the sort of carrot and the organic changes in consumer habits. But I think that's a really great insight. It's like, even if it's legislation, don't see it as a stick, see it as an opportunity to go and save money and get this win-win situation. Tony, what is what Paul is saying aligned with what you see with the rest of the members of RLA?
Absolutely, Helen, and I'm really honored to be here, and we have what I consider a serious responsibility because we're the voice of the industry globally. And what I recognize with Paul and Intel and others, many of our members, our board especially, are global companies. So what happens in Europe hits them hard, whether it's Dell and HP, Walmart or Home Depot or Amazon. They are trying to be global players. If you're going to be global, you can't do something just in Europe and not have it happen in the US. So as we transition more in Europe towards the circular economy by mandates, that affects those companies in the US who try to do business over there. And let's again carefully define this. Remember, we're trying to go from the linear economy, which is the take, make, use, and waste approach, to this circular economy where it's take it, make it, use it, and reuse it, do something else with it. And what I've noticed, I'll give you a good example, is in our association, we had many members who were recyclers. And they're recognizing that sometimes recycling is more expensive to do for products than it is to make new products. That was a huge revelation to me and an eye-opener, and like, well, wait, we're going to lose the war here. But the reality is now companies like Sims Lifecycle Services, who is a global recycler, but says we need to figure out how to remake that stuff and reduce the returns, but what can we do with the stuff that comes back? We do not want to keep recycling. So linear is recycling. Circular becomes more involved with the reuse and the importance of that, creating a secondary market for all of these products and the materials that come out of the products. So I'm really seeing the members of the RLA recognizing you can't just think linear anymore. You have to think circular if you're going to survive the next 10 to 20, 30 years.
Right. Tony, that's fantastic. And I love that you're putting just pure recycling in the linear economy. And I think that's a really interesting insight. Thank you. Stephen, last time in July, we talked a lot about a lot of different rules, regulations, metrics, and strategies. But as a service provider, how do you see companies dealing with supply chain changes when it comes to adopting a more circular approach?
It's a great question, Helen. Thank you. Well, first of all, I'll say I love what you said right at the top of the webinar, that because we do tend to over fixate on regulation, and it's certainly important, obviously, compliance with regulations is necessary. But that's not the only driver for a circular economy. We are dealing with an investor landscape that is increasingly activist, with consumer sentiments that we're starting to see data that shows that consumers are making choices on brands based on ESG and sustainability. And certainly that's true with partnerships as well, right? So it's a bigger landscape than just regulatory. It's the first shift that people need to make. Look at it holistically as part of your business strategy, and then we're seeing best-in-class companies doing that. And I think the second piece is, historically, just dovetail on what Tony just said brilliantly, I think where the recycles at the end, what was there? The last thing was waste, right? That's the last piece of the linear supply chain, right? That's brilliantly put. I've heard him use it before and written it down a couple of times. The circular economy, in that old world where all we cared about was either it goes in the trash bin or it goes to the recycle bin. I mean, that's really a dead model. If we haven't figured that out yet, everybody needs to know that's the way you're thinking about circularity. You've got it wrong. Period. This is not going to fly in the future, right? The whole concept of bolting something onto the end of your supply chain, that is my circularity, right? And I've got metrics for how much I'm making it to recycler, is just an outdated way of thinking of things. The most successful companies are integrating circularity into their supply chain strategy, designed for circularity right at the front end, from when you're sketching out new products and thinking about, the circularity piece. We're seeing wholesale different business models, like product as a service is starting to come up, where things are leased instead of sold. That allows, folks to control what happens post-sale to that product. And you touched on this as well, Tony, and I know we'll talk about it more, but really thinking through robust resale markets, post-sale sales opportunities, right? I think that's where we can shift from thinking about circularity as a cost center, a necessary evil, loss avoidance, into new revenue streams, and thinking about how you can bifurcate your markets intelligently to maximize the revenue out of resale. I think those are kind of the key themes that we're seeing with our client base.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how innovative some of the biggest companies have been. With IKEA has just been piloting a market for selling its furniture secondhand. Although I hope it comes with all the little Allen keys. Oh my goodness. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of changes afoot, and some very big companies have gotten behind the idea of a genuine circularity that's more about reuse and resell than recycle. So that's great. So this is a good time to ask our audience what they think. We're going to give you a quick poll. The question is, when your company is defining circular economy goals, which aspects of their product lifestyle are the top priority? Is it design, reuse, or recycle? Please enter your answers now.
Some like Jeopardy music or something to play with.
Sort of that, yes.
Oh.
Give you a couple of minutes to respond, but I'm really interested to see these answers, actually.
Yeah.
All right. So the question again was, when your company is defining circular economy goals, which aspects of their product life cycle are the top priority? And we have reuse at 50%. We have design at 30%, and we have recycle at 20%. Again, reuse at 50, design at 30, and recycle at 20. And I'm going to guess, I'm curious what you guys have to say about this, is that if we'd done this maybe even 2 years ago, that recycle would have come out on top.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Yep. Well, the truth is, we may have tainted the answer pool a little bit, because we were sort of hinting at the fact that recycle's not shouldn't be
not
your
the
focus.
Right answer.
It's not that recycle's not part of the strategy. It's not that it isn't important. It's just it's not a holistic answer, right? And I think that's the thing people need to understand. But I'm actually encouraged to see 50% of people focused on reuse, because that, as a top priority, I should say, that is really where a lot of the value stems from.
That's amazing.
I was disappointed not to see more focus on design, and I'll tell you why. When I was at Philips, when they asked me to step out of sales and take over returns management, oh my God, trying to understand why we were getting so much product back that had no fault found, no technical failure, nothing wrong with it. Oh my God, 90% of what we got back, there's nothing wrong with it. And what are we doing? And I actually was able to conduct a survey of consumers who had returned things. It was sneaky. We used the university to do it. We gave a Starbucks gift card, but we found 76% of those people said it didn't do what I expected it to do. And that was an eye opener. And by the way, it came back to us a couple years later when McKinsey tried to sell us a report that said that, and Accenture said that, and I felt like a rocket scientist. You know, I'm a genius here finding this out. But that design aspect is important because that's way uphill. It's a challenge with technology because of planned obsolescence, but the design being way uphill, if you can design it to be reused, to Stephen's point, that is the biggest segment of opportunity, but that design is critical and it doesn't happen enough. And that's where Paul and Intel have lived as well. And I know that's an important aspect.
Yeah, and
well,
I was just going to
ask.
sorry,
I
Alan.
was
Yeah,
going to ask you,
I was just going to say, just on that point about design, I guess, you know, it's of its time. I mean, I've been in the industry. Actually, I was looking at my history of my recently, and actually, sadly, I'm nearer 40 years than anything in the industry. But you know, but this design for X, DFX, as we used to call it, Intel, the X has changed over time. You know, whether it's test, whether it's usability, whether it's manufacturability, and I think we're coming into this nascent pace of you know, circularity, or I think it may also be called design for environment. So I think, you know, to me, it's encouraging to see the responses being actually as high on design. I think there's maybe a challenge between recognizing it needs to be that and what it actually is, and that's probably the journey, you know, we have to make as organizations from where we are today. But I guess that's, you know, we are at this point in time, I think, so it's good to see that.
That's great, Paul. Well, I mean, I just want to stay with that for a minute because Intel in particular, you know, is vulnerable to obsolescence of the products. You know, I mean, how do you reuse a chip that's not as fast as the one that you can go and buy now? You know, that's how do you deal with that challenge?
Yeah, well, it's a mindset shift for sure. I mean, I think when you know, products are sort of a 6-month life cycle in terms of sitting on the top of the sales page. But I think going back to the point I made earlier, and Tony mentioned it also, I think this actually, I think it was mentioned a couple of times. Stephen mentioned it also. This whole conversation around secondary market, and there is a use for that product. There is a value associated with that product. I mean, Intel's base value was we take the chip back and we do a precious metal reclaim and we use the recycle that back in the process. But there are many stages in that, and you know, historically companies get concerned about cannibalization and they're concerned about all these things. Right. But in reality, you know, there is value associated with that, and there is a need at a certain level. And even if you look in, you know, my business in reverse logistics, and Tony knows this, the challenges you have sustaining a warranty promise for a product 2 or 3 years down the line when you have no inventory, you know, in itself is a market for some of that product. So I think it's just that mindset shift of not be concerned about it necessarily being viewed as a cannibalization activity, recognizing there is incremental, you know, value there. And then one of the biggest elements for us is whether we liked it or not, people were selling Intel products on the secondary market. You know, we weren't involved in that conversation. We weren't getting any revenue from that. We certainly weren't controlling any quality. So it's a reality, and we decided to embrace that approach and look at where we've got opportunities to, you know, position that product at some level back in the market to meet a demand, to generate some circularity, sustainability, but also to generate some revenue. Yeah.
Really glad you mentioned that, Paul. I'm going to dovetail on that quickly. I'm going to withhold the name of the brand to protect the guilty. But I'll say, I remember sitting in a quarterly business review with a client some years ago talking about this issue, circularity. You have a lot of returns coming back. Tony alluded to it earlier. That 90% number was really high, but, you know, or 90% was no fault found. I think it was.
No fault found.
90% was no fault found. That's a very high number, but it's high everywhere, right? You get a lot of good product touching your dock. We all know that, right? we had proposed using, and this was consumer products, we'll just say that. And we had proposed using marketplaces like Amazon and eBay to dispose of that product, get it resold, instead of sending it off to a recycle, right? And the answer from their marketing team was an emphatic no. We don't want to cannibalize the business. And live in the meeting, I pulled up eBay and I typed in their brand name, and there were 77,000 listings. 77,000 listings, right? And I'm like, you're already on eBay, just to be clear. Your brand is on eBay, but you don't control it. You don't control the price point. You're not filtering what ends up on the market. You're not segmenting where you want to sell product. You're already there. So don't be a passive participant in the secondary market. Be an active participant was the message. It wasn't terribly received well in real time, to be honest with you.
That was going to be my next question. Yeah.
Nobody likes the know-it-all who tells them like you should be thinking differently. But the reality is, that brand is now very much leaned into the secondary market because times have changed, right? Those old days of like, oh, I just don't want to be there. And nobody's thinking like that anymore.
Yeah. Wow. That's really interesting. Yeah, that whole thing about embracing that you're on a secondary market, whether you like it or not. I love that. Tony, looking at these poll results with the design considerations being chiefly reuse and then design and then recycling last. What do you expect to be the major challenges to implement a circular approach? And let's focus on how to reduce returns, for example. And I love Paul's example. But Tony, what do you see in terms of focus on reducing returns?
Well, recognizing that we have some technology representation here, we alluded to the planned obsolescence issue, and I will applaud Paul and Intel finally getting the message and not coming up with a new Pentium every year processor. Eventually settled down into Core i3, i5, i7, and kept that for a while. That helps consumers have confidence buying something that it won't be obsolete in a year. The phone industry still has a major problem with that, the mobile phone industry. Yep. But they're figuring out how to build in that secondary market into the design planning stages. So, so the major challenges are the planned obsolescence unless you plan for an effective obsolescence. And again, that's the example the mobile industry is doing. Because they're happy to. I think the CTIA quotes statistics of the average phone might have up to 5 users now in its lifetime, and that's phenomenal, right? That's what we want, and so those are the challenges, but also the opportunity is there, and I think the poll shows that 50%. Thinking about reuse is fantastic. And by the way, even though we're just high tech here, let's not forget the other categories. Apparel is interesting. There's more than anecdotal evidence. There's good evidence that the newest generations, millennials and others, are buying clothing, and when they buy it, they look online and see what it's selling for on the used market. If they're going to buy it new, then what can I get for it when I resell it? If it's Ralph Lauren or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. But just the fact that people are paying attention to what's going on in the secondary market, that I can do something with this in the future, that's a culture shift that we need, and it's slowly happening.
Right, because the apparel industry is one of the worst offenders when it comes to waste and yeah, so that's anything that works.
Helen, that's a webinar in itself, right?
Yes, it's true. It is true. Indeed. Excellent. Paul, can you provide an example of Intel handling returned goods, and are there any innovative ways that was handled? I mean, we talked about you implementing some innovations. Tell us what they were.
Yeah, I guess much like Tony mentioned, a lot of the focus in the industry is about stopping things coming back, and finding, and certainly we spent a lot of time educating customers, putting technology in place, and providing services and solutions that would help, we would hope would help people maintain the product longer and certainly reduce our no fault found type problems. And I guess we've been sort of singularly unsuccessful. Well, not singularly, as an industry, we've been unsuccessful in doing that because customer behavior difficult to change. But I think our focus has been how do we if the product, in addition to just looking at stopping stuff coming back, I talked about the secondary market there earlier. This one of the conversations we had when we talked about cannibalization and actually getting agreement at Intel that we would go down a sort of a secondary market path was recognizing that maybe Tony mentioned that recognizing the person who's buying your $100 CPU is not the person who's ever going to buy your $1,000 CPU. So you've got segmentation in the marketplace. So I think that's been one of the biggest things for us is trying to partner with companies who have access to those routes that we can, if you like, in parallel, continue to make the product more stickable with the customer. Well, a lot of our customers, Intel's customers now are OEM based, but as opposed to end users and channel customers. But I think focusing on that, how do we manage that? How do we incentivize it in parallel? The recognition that it's coming back. How do we maximize the value of that product coming back and tier that process? And for sure, we're still putting stuff through the precious metal reclaim. We're still trying to we're still recovering plastics from we're all doing all that stuff, but we're trying to get much more of the product in the middle. And I think Stephen, you mentioned that a lot of product which is fundamentally good product. How can we make sure that is positioned in the marketplace accordingly with some level of trust in the customer base that they know the quality of that product, etc. So that's been a big shift for us.
Helen,
That's really
Helen,
go ahead.
I need to give a plug for Intel because there's two major things that the world needs to know about what Intel has done. Number one, when they first connected with me at Philips about 25 years ago, I'm old, sorry. The ease of use roundtable was an Intel function that was designed to create standards like the plug that plugs your keyboard into your computer back then, just color coding and things like that to make it simple to use. The keyboard, the mouse, the plugs, the colors, simple things like that, because the average time for computer setup back then was 6 hours. They wanted to get it down, which we've succeeded in doing. In fact, the statement by Intel was, we want computers to be as easy to use as a television. And we almost got there. What we did is we made televisions more like computers, so they're harder to use. Okay, that's number one about Intel. They changed the world on that. Number two, they've changed the world because USB-C is going to become the global standard. One plug to, it's like Lord of the Rings. One plug to rule them all. And thank God for that, because Europe has a standard now that says next year, every plug better be the same at the end of it. And USB-C, God bless Intel for doing that. Eventually, we can throw those drawers of cables away. Sorry, I just needed to plug that in. They deserve major credit for that.
And I think that's great. But I was just going to ask, actually, Paul and Tony, and maybe Stephen would chime in as well. It sounds like there needs to be a distinction between what you're getting back as a rejected sale, like a return, and something where you're catching up with something at the end of at least its first users' use. Is that a distinction that's important to make, or I mean, I would imagine they have different challenges for reducing those amounts?
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, there's a broad remit of. I mean, I was listening to something recently, and if you go back to a return center, if you're in a manufacturing or a warehouse, everything's nice and neat and boxes go up and pallets and everything looks super. You go into a return center, things are just thrown into boxes, so there is a need to segregate or a desire to segregate a product, because that, is a starting point to try and determine what your optimal routes are. So I think that is a true statement, is that you're not just dealing with necessarily bad product or end of life product, but you're also dealing with, good product that was returned for whatever reason, either the customer couldn't use it or it was access to inventory requirements or whatever. So there is, that control is a challenge, but it's something that's it's key to making the best disposition on the product, I guess. Right. Steve, you probably see that, Jeff.
The range of products to come back is everything from the brand newest gen, obviously, new inbox. That's got one path to it, all the way to 10 years ago, something's come back that really is a question of like, how do we recover some value out of this and keep it out of landfill and what have you, and all points in between, right? So it is a really good distinction and point to make, that when you're thinking about circularity and your path for the products that are coming back, the first thing to think about is, we forget this, right? It's reduce, reuse, recycle. That's what we talk about as consumers. It's the same way in supply chain. If you can reduce by not getting a return, because a better design, like Tony alluded to, right? Color code your ports, and then there's less confusion. People aren't going to throw their hands up in the air and just send it back. Oh, darn thing doesn't work, right? Like, so looking at every bucket of that, in that order, that's the value. That's the thing we forget. Reduce is more valuable than reuse, which is more valuable than recycle, which is better than throw in the trash bin, right? So that's the pecking order. And if we remember that, apply that to our supply chain decisions, the truth is, in your circularity plan, you need to have all those points. You need to be thinking about that all the way through, not just the end. Yeah.
Oh, that's a really great way of thinking about it. Thank you, Stephen. That's fantastic. So, Stephen, what are the other challenges you're seeing for your customers in this ever-changing landscape? What's top of mind right now in terms of challenges customers are wrestling with?
Well, the challenges are numerous. I'll say that, right? There's been more. I don't know, Tony. I'm going to make this statement. I've not made it in front of you. You can agree or disagree. I'd love your opinion, but I think there's been more change in circularity in the last 10 years than probably in the prior 50 combined, right? I mean, we're just going through a huge breakneck change. I got a nod out of Tony, so I'm going to say that I'm not off base, right? We feel a lot of pressure for our clients to figure this out, because it's the old "who moved my cheese," but it's been moved like 9 times in the last like 12 months. And the reality is the cheese is going to get moved a few more times. The first thing we got to understand is, like, what we see today in the landscape is not going to be next year. It's not going to be 5 years from now. And there's almost a design for being nimble that we need to be thinking about, and like maybe thinking one step ahead of where we are right now. The most painful place to be with regulation is one step behind it. Right? So when you got to do something with a gun to your head, you got 6 months to get it done. That could be a very painful and expensive journey. If you've been thinking through those issues for 6 months or a year, when that regulation comes along, you're in a much better position to actually like operationalize a plan, right? So that's the first thing I'd say, is trying to anticipate. Look, all of our crystal balls are broken. Everybody on this call, nobody can tell you exactly what's going to happen, but we can look at trends, and we can say that that luck favors the prepared in life in general. And so trying to be one step ahead of it. And I'll say, principally, the biggest challenges, I think, are at the very front end of the circularity discussion, design elements. That's a place where most companies haven't put any thought in the past. It's really the new frontier. And the very back end, because the old, oh, I don't want to cannibalize my business, so you just give me a certificate of destruction, we move on. Like, because that's dead. If it isn't dead in your company, it will be soon. It needs to be, right? Like, because that's dead, the questions of cannibalization and bifurcation of your markets, can you segment appropriately so that your secondary sales don't become cannibalistic to your primary sales, right? Or is that a way to think of that as can we open new markets with that, and by segmenting, as opposed to just dumping cheap product out there as competing with your new stuff? Those are the 2 areas I think companies are wrestling with the most. And to touch on the design piece, because the only thing we've said about design so far is Tony's point, which is, and actually Paul alluded to it too, but super spot on. Like, design for ease of use is going to reduce returns. That's great. We want to do that. But there's other elements of design, like, for some folks on this call, they've probably heard of this before, others may not, but we're working with companies now that are built, we used to say, if it's not open box, I can call it new, right? But if it's open box, that's going in the recover, that whatever, that's going to the shredder, what have you, right? Building in really simple things like, can you tell if this has been connected to power or not, right? In a test phase, right? If it's not been connected to power, I get to treat that as a new product. Now that's going back into a reuse. I could actually sell that as a primary A SKU. That is an example of reuse, because in the old days, we would have destroyed that product, right? And try to do whatever value recovery we have, but it's never been used. Going one step further, has it ever connected to the internet? Maybe it powered up, but it never connected to anything. Okay, well, that's a new product still too, right? Just building in a couple sensors and things like that on the front end, this can be different for different industries, but or different verticals. But those kinds of things allow you to take that 90% no fault found that Tony talked about and turn a lot more of that into high value A SKUs, and then confidently be able to stand there, what's a B SKU now that has been used, and how do I handle that? But that keeps a lot of product out of that, like destruction and recycling channel.
And
and even, sorry, go ahead.
To Stephen's point, to help give your audience more ammunition, what's driving the need for circularity greater in the last few years, is volume. Okay. I can say, again, being old, but when I started in this area, it was maybe 150 to 200 billion in returns in the US. We're going to hear numbers soon that indicate we're approaching 900 billion in returns in the United States alone. Return rates used to be 6 to 7% when it was only brick and mortar. E-commerce has tripled that. We're looking at around 17% return rates. That's enormous volume. We cannot just keep putting it into landfill. And one thing we exported badly to Europe is the returns policies. So Europe says, no, we're not letting that happen. We're going to do something. And those rules that they put in place. But Stephen, that's the major factor. You're right. More people thinking circularity, reuse, secondary market, because there's so much of this stuff. What are we going to do with it? It's sad, but it's getting there.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony. I've got some comment from my cat, but I don't think he knows much about reverse logistics. So Paul, actually, I want to ask you about customer sentiment and investor pressure evolving as a circular approach, and an accelerator towards ESG goals. But I'm also curious what your perspective is, because there's been quite a lot in the news lately of some major companies stepping back from their sustainability goals. They're sort of, net zero by 2025 or whatever. There's been quite a few headlines just in the last few weeks. Do you think there's a temptation for companies to go, well, look, it looked like it was all going in one direction for a while, but maybe I'll just hang back and see if this is actually going to be a real thing?
I guess sadly, yes. I would say my personal view would be that, and I think also, I would say recent political appointments or probably reinforce a level of uncertainty as to what's going to be, what that direction is going to be, and therefore, where there's uncertainty, people will look to, I guess, potentially take advantage of that. But so I think there is. I think Steve mentioned we don't have a crystal ball. I do think, going back to the essence of what we're trying to do, you can look at it at a couple of different levels. I mean, for sure, to solve the whole big problem is very complicated, and it's going to take lots of time, and probably it's going to take lots of money. But you don't have to do it all at once. I think a couple of things to me are very, very important. I do think that fundamentally, people are looking at differentiators with companies that have a positive focus on ESG and a positive focus on circularity. Something it's a differentiator in the market. I think the other thing that we've seen is that even from an employee perspective, people want to come work for companies that have got that ethos, and therefore it's it generates a level of enthusiasm, and that's not just a one-shot deal. Because really, what you want is to put the challenge down to the organization to say, this is where we're going. How do we? This is where we need to be. Let's be creative about how we go get there. For sure, there'll be elements of legal requirements to do from time to time, or there'll be twists and turns in the road. But I mean, fundamentally, if you can convince people we're trying to do the right thing, and encourage them to figure out how to get that mindset to make those changes, actually great things can happen. So I think for sure there is investor pressure, there is customer pressure, but I think a lot of it is down to trying to move the organization from a denial, kicking and screaming, phase to saying, really, we're trying to do the right thing. And maybe the timelines will be longer, maybe the scope will be different, but certainly you want to try and keep a momentum of moving in that direction. Because apart from anything else, as Tony mentioned, there's a fundamental cost coming down the line that we just can't afford either. So we either have to spend it, in fixing the problem, or we're going to have to spend it anyway in making product. So I think there's, we can be sometimes a little short-sighted, but one of my concerns would be, there's a lot of uncertainty in the world today about who's pushing for what, and therefore is that going to be an opportunity for people to say, well, I'm just checking out, I'm just going to check out for a while, so.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I think that really brings us on to the whole idea of fostering a circular culture. The mindset, as you're saying, Paul. Tony, do you think that that fostering a circular culture in that perspective can actually drive change faster?
Absolutely. And I wish we could think of more ways to do it, but let's give examples. For example, the culture of Japan is you don't take things back because you're insulting somebody or you're admitting you're stupid. Their return rates are like 2% as a nation. That's crazy, right? You turn to the United States where we're running 17 to 40 or 50% on apparel. It's because we become a culture of entitlement. What we have not developed is a culture of why do we want you to keep this? How do we incentivize you to keep this? We've been talking about sticks. We don't have enough carrots out there. An example of a carrot is when I look for a flight or I look for a hotel room, I'm now being offered these non-refundable deals that are a little bit better than a refundable one. And no one's done that yet on the return side on e-commerce. How about saying to the people, look, you bought these things before, you love it, we love you, we'll give you a discount if you buy it without a right to return, barring defective issues. But if you buy it and keep it, you'll get a better price. No one's done that yet, but they have in the hotel and airline industry. And that's got to come. We have to figure out how to change the culture with carrots, not sticks. Europe, again, the culture there is strong about recognizing they have land space, 1/3 the size of the US with just as many people. So they recognize that. They grew up with that. They've got old cities, old stores, old houses, things are addressed by that. And we love that culture, and it's needs to come this way somehow with a carrot versus a stick. And that would drive a circular culture faster if there's more carrots out there than sticks, because it reduces returns. And then we need to start using the term that the auto industry came up with, certified pre-owned. They charge more for the vehicle that's used, but they get more for it because people think somehow it's more golden than a regular used one. We have to do that. And companies like Stevens and Flex help us do that by giving certification, grading standards, etc. That will drive the circular culture faster.
It's a great call. And we're starting to see that actually, that certified return. We're talking with a laptop manufacturer on the very topic right now. It's like, right. Instead of just selling it off to an ITAD and somebody else refurbishes it and they get the margin, what's the benefit of keeping that stuff in-house? It's a certified return. It's got our brand on there as certified, and what does that do to the price point? And in essence, I mean, this is where circularity becomes the profit center, right? It's the ITAD's margin is the brand's opportunity, if they think about it, right? And when you put that certified and premature on there, that price point goes up, right? Because it comes with a manufacturer warranty, not a reseller warranty. So that's a really good point, Tony.
Yeah. This whole idea of taking control of the secondary market, very important. I'm going to roll us into a slightly different topic now. Because we want to talk. We've talked about the culture, but let's talk about the success and how success gets measured in terms of circularity. So we're going to have another poll with you, the audience. Please answer this question. What metrics do you use to track the success of your circular economy initiatives? Is it A, waste reduction, B, recycled material usage, C, product lifespan, D, reduction of returned products, or another metric? What metrics do you use to track the success of your circular economy initiatives? Waste reduction, recycled material usage, product lifespan, reduction of return products, or another metric? We're going to give you a couple of minutes to answer, and then we'll see what the results are.
Be interested to see the results on this one.
Oh, all right. Okay, here we are. So again, the question was, what metrics do you use to track the success of your circular economy initiatives? And we've got a tied first, 29% waste reduction, 29% reduction of returned products. Then we have at 21% product lifespan, at 14% recycled material usage, and at 7% another metric. So again, in order, it's a double first of reduction of returned products and waste reduction, then product lifespan and recycled material usage. These are the metrics that people are using right now to track the success of circularity. So thank you for that. Stephen, looking at these results, what is an indicator that best, what if you had to pick an ideal metric, just one, what would be the best one to measure how successful circularity is going?
I like it that you give me the tough questions. That's great. Thank you. I'll say, look, the reality is kind of a trick question because all of these things matter, right? There's none of them work without the others. And at the end of the day, there's a host of things we need to do. I was rather encouraged by the fact that 7% of the answers were another metric, though, because honestly, to my way of thinking, we have looked at circularity as a cost center and as loss avoidance generally historically. I think the opportunity, and with that, we've created this false dichotomy in my mind, which is that there's a trade-off between doing things right environmentally and for ESG purposes and profitability. And the reality is the low-hanging fruit and it's not even low-hanging fruit, sorry, that's the wrong term. The big reward for a company is when they get to the point where they can think about their ESG and their circularity goals as revenue and profit opportunities, right? The best projects that have really been embraced and adopted in my experience with clients have been when they've identified a lot of money that is potential from that channel, right? So I think the other metric that I'd be thinking of is like profitability out of my circularity channel. How can I turn circularity into new revenue streams, new dollar, new profit? It is the most impactful because that's the one that's going to get a lot of investment, and that's the one that's going to get people throughout the supply chain to really line up behind it and get the whole organization behind it, as opposed to this thing that happens in a little silo in the corner of the supply chain, offices, right? Where it's like, I don't know, I've got this much budget, what can I do with it, right? Those things tend to be less impactful. But at the end of the day, I said it earlier, it's reduce, reuse, recycle. So anywhere that we can actually reduce something in the first place, I think A and D, which tied for number one, are probably the most impactful because we're reducing waste throughout the process and we're reducing return products, which isn't just the carbon impact and what have you of the product itself and the potential impact in landfill, what have you, but also all the transportation implications of that as well.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to move us into the Q&A session because we're getting a little tight on time. This is all just so fascinating, and there's, I think, so many interesting takeaways. But before we move into the Q&A from the audience, I just wanted to go to each of you in turn, Stephen, Paul, and Tony. Think about where we are 5 years from now, and given the path that we're on, give me some bold predictions on something that you think will be true then in 5 years' time that isn't today. Stephen.
A bold prediction. Okay, so this can't be a layup. All right, I think data centers today are exploding, right? With AI, it's obviously massive. We've gone to the cloud as opposed to, on-premise solutions largely, and now with AI, it's another reinvestment in data centers. There's very little green going on in that space, right? Every drive that goes into a data center is generally hitting the shredder at the end of 3 to 5 years, right? And perfectly good drives that probably could be reused, but we've got challenges in, regulation around data leaks and concern around data leaks as well, right? So we've got competing initiatives, right? So bold prediction, I think in the next 5 years, we're going to figure out how to marry those two things and come up with a data erasure standard that will allow a good chunk of drives leaving data centers to go into the secondary market for folks who don't need the bleeding edge of drives. That's my bold prediction.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I want to hear your bold prediction, and keep it short.
Okay, no, I've lots of things I could say as well as my crystal ball being very fuzzy. I think maybe the bold but sort of tongue-in-cheek comment for me would be, reverse logistics. What today is reverse logistics is going to be the key driver of the circular economy. The key, it's going to come out of the closet. It's going to come out of the sidelines and become a major player in the supply chain. And I think that's a huge opportunity. And I think I hope that happens. But I think we all know how critical we are to the business. Sometimes the business doesn't understand that. But I think certainly in circular economy, I think that's the opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah, well, all of us have been in the business for long enough to see that, even just supply chain and logistics used to be the cupboard under the stairs, and it was just a cost center and nobody cared, and that's totally changed. We've got chief, logistics officers now. Tony, I'm going to guess that you agree that reverse logistics will be central to circularity. Get any other bold predictions?
I'll be very bold. One is returns are going to keep going up. So that's an easy one. Number two, somebody's going to figure out how to implement an incentive program to slow down returns. Number three, all e-commerce people are going to have to start charging for returns. But the boldest statement would be to say there's going to be a C-level position at some company for this role, focused on circular economy, focused on returns reduction, reverse logistics. We don't even have a vice president of reverse logistics that I can find on LinkedIn in this country. So we really need C-level attention, and that should happen maybe in 5 years.
Okay, great. Thank you, gentlemen. I'm going to grab, we're moving along now. I'm going to grab one. I've only got time for like one question from the audience. I think this is a really good one. Are early adopters, and this is up for grabs, are early adopters of circular economy strategies finding economic success? To go back to that metric that you mentioned, Stephen, cold hard cash. Is it actually paying off already?
On this one real quick, because this is near and dear to my heart. Yes, the answer is yes, and it's been really significant. I will, to use one example, we've got household goods, luxury vacuum cleaners, we'll say. For a long time, they were of the idea we didn't want any of this stuff making it back out in the marketplace. I don't want my stuff on eBay, what have you, right? And, they're currently refurbishing, we're reselling those through secondary markets. And, they found that it not only didn't cannibalize their business, but they opened up a whole new category of buyers, right? Folks that wouldn't pay $600 for a vacuum will pay $200 in a refurb program, right? I'm making up the numbers, but they've expanded their market, improved their profitability through it. It's been a significant win for them. And I think there's a lot more of that to come. Yeah.
Great. Okay. I'm afraid we're running out the clock, so I'm going to go to, we have one final question that I'm going to ask each of you to answer. So we all get a final say. So this is, and this is, I think, really what we want to, the audience to take away. What are the key considerations when forming partnerships to develop circular business models? Paul, what would you say about that?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. First of all, I'd say trust. I mean, your brand is very valuable and you want to be partnered with somebody who's going to respect that brand and protect it. Secondly, we talked about decision making and making, disposition calls smartly. So information and data visibility and a good structure there. Also, someone who understands the business. Partner with somebody who knows the business or who can provide that expertise, not just at an operational level, but also a leadership level. And lastly, we talked about global nature of the business. Someone who can provide directly or indirectly a network and reach to deliver the services for you. There's 4 key things I would say.
Great, thank you, Tony.
Well, from my
key considerations, yeah.
From my view, the key consideration is finding partners who can do end-to-end solutions. They can help handle the return, process it, repair it, refurbish it, help remarket it, and provide it back into your secondary market quickly. Because to Stephen's point, companies like Flex are very important that they can do it fast before the product's obsolete. And
Right.
so that and that gives you increased asset recovery the faster you get it back to market. So one partner, if you have to ship it around the country to do all these steps, you lose time, you lose money. So a company like Flex and others in the RLA, those are companies who focus on shorter windows, do it all.
Great, thank you. Great answer. And let's go back to Flex for a final. What are the key considerations when forming partnerships from Flex's point of view, Stephen?
Thanks, Helen. Great answer, Paul and Tony. I'll just start with the mantra that you have to start with the end in mind. If you're trying to think of circularity in a silo, you're going to get this bolt-on thing at the end of your supply chain that's ugly and doesn't fit and doesn't do much for you. You really got to get this ingrained in your culture. We talked about that. And so I think when you're thinking about partners with that in mind, be looking for partners where circularity is part of their DNA. And it's not just a bolt-on for them. And the easy way to tell that is if it's important to them, they'll be talking to you about it. You want to be working with folks that are thinking that one step ahead, what is coming next year or the year after, not just rearview mirror management. That would be my advice.
Great. I like keep the end in mind at the beginning. Excellent. And trust and end-to-end service. All great answers. Thank you so much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you so much to Paul, Tony, and Stephen. Really interesting conversation. And then a special thanks to you, the audience, for participating, especially in those polls. We like those, actually. I think we've learned a lot today about how to move forward with getting a culture of circularity into your company or increasing it. We had a lot of questions today, and we'll be answering the ones we didn't get to with you offline. Contact info for Stephen Beard at Flex is on your screen right now. And right now there's a QR code that you can see that gives you a link to the previous Flex webinar on circularity that we did in July. And do go back and listen to that if you didn't attend. It was also extremely interesting. Those of you who registered for this webinar will receive an email later with a link to view this webinar on demand and the other one. And you can share those links with anybody. There will also be contact information for Flex, of course. Thank you to everybody for your participation. Stay safe, stay happy, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Helen.
everyone.
Bye. Thank you.